Thanks for joining us today. Hello and welcome to Business Daily. I'm Lee Ji-yoon. We have plenty on our plate today, so let's get started with a look at today's highlights. It's been almost 3 weeks since Korea's anti-graft law, or the Kim Young-nan Act, took effect. So how badly have businesses, especially restaurants, been affected by the implementation of this law? Some of Korea's biggest companies are struggling with a series of challenges, prompting questions about whether there's too much dependence on these big players. These stories and more coming right up. But first, a top executive from Germany's Audi AG will be summoned by Seoul prosecutors on Thursday in relation to the Volkswagen emissions scandal. The Seoul Central District Prosecutor's Office said it will summon former Audi Volkswagen Korea Managing Director Trevor Hill, who oversaw operations when vehicles related to the emissions scandal were imported and sold. Prosecutors will look to see whether he was part of submitting false documents and manipulating tests from VW vehicles during his tenure from 2007 to 2012. In response to growing concerns over the country's massive household debt, Korea's financial regulator is looking to tighten regulations on savings banks that are extending loans at a rapid pace. The Financial Supervisory Service says it is considering rolling out stricter standards to improve fiscal soundness at these banks and reduce their exposure to risky assets. Since last year, savings banks, which lend at higher interest rates than commercial banks, have been extending loans to households at a rapid pace. Compared to 2014, where overall loans of savings banks stood at $23.8 billion as of the second quarter, that figure rose to nearly $37 billion as of the end of June this year. The vice chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve says the Fed is very close to its employment and inflation targets, deemed the markers for raising rates. Speaking at the Economic Club of New York on Monday, Stanley Fischer also suggested that low rates can lead to longer and deeper recessions, making the economy more vulnerable. Pressure for a rate hike in December is building. The U.S. Core Personnel Consumption Expenditure Index, the Fed's primary inflation guide, hit 1.7% in August. And the unemployment rate in September recorded 5%, considered full employment in the U.S. But Fisher added that raising rates is not a simple decision, as there are factors beyond the Fed's control, such as slower overseas growth, weak investment, and an aging population. Aggressive tactics by Chinese fishermen appear to be putting a dent in Korea's squid catch. The National Federation of Fisheries Cooperative says the amount of squid sold last year from its 18 co-ops along the East Sea came to less than 67,500 tons, marking the fourth consecutive year of decline. It's also a 20% drop in over 3 years. Experts are attributing the slump to Chinese trawlers that are overfishing in North Korean waters. Squid migrate south every year from North Korean waters to spawn near South Korea's port city of Busan and Jeju Island. It's been 3 full weeks now since the anti-graft Kim Young-nan law was put into motion. Although it's still early, its impact is already being seen at government offices and local restaurants. And our Eunice Kim takes us to the administrative capital of Sejong City for the view there.
A bustling cafeteria. It's a canteen inside a government office in Sejong City that fills up quickly come lunchtime. Sales are said to have soared 20% since the Kim Young-nan law came into effect. Workers have been erring on the side of caution, staying away from meeting over meals that can be questioned on job relevance to avoid a first strike.
There's still some uncertainty over what's legal and illegal, so we're refraining from outside meetings and sticking to formal events.
Step outside and the line between winners and losers are clear. To eat at this nearby Chinese restaurant, people rush to wait in line. The owner says sales have shot up 50% since the anti-corruption law was put into motion.
We're backed up with reservations. Customers are preferring low-priced dishes, so we are grateful.
On the other hand, a Korean barbecue restaurant once popular for hosting big-ticket departmental dinners or business meals now sits empty. Sales have taken a beating, dropping to one-third of previous levels.
Business has been so bad that our workers are voluntarily suggesting unpaid leave. We have yet to implement this, though.
Money companies spent on entertaining clients last year is said to have closed in on 10 trillion won. That is a stunning sum of about 8.8 billion US dollars. Some point out that the money saved in hosting costs in the post-Kim Young-lan law world should be passed on to workers in wage increases to avoid a further slump in domestic demand. Eunice Kim, Business Daily.
The trickle-down effect is used to describe a model that claims if big businesses and high-income earners do well, then the rest will also benefit, as their increased wealth will filter through all parts of society. With that belief, for a very, very long time, the Korean government has put forward big business-friendly economic policies, hoping that the growth of conglomerates will eventually spill over to smaller businesses and create more jobs. But now, many experts are saying that the trickle-down effect simply doesn't work. Samsung Electronics and Hyundai Motor, which accounted for 20% of the country's GDP as of last year, continued to face challenges, with their third quarter operating profit estimates falling below market expectations. So what should be done in order to ensure that Korea's heavy dependence on big companies doesn't become a stumbling block for the economy? Let's find out.
Just last month, Samsung Electronics announced a global recall of its Galaxy Note 7 after reports of overheating batteries catching fire, before deciding to terminate production this month. Also in September, unionized workers at Hyundai Motor went on full strike for the first time in 12 years, protesting the introduction of a performance-based pay system. In the face of such challenges, there are growing concerns that smaller companies dependent on business ties with some of Korea's largest conglomerates will end up shouldering even heavier losses. The damage is already being underscored, with Korea's exports falling nearly 6% last month from a year earlier amid falling shipments of cars and smartphones. Exports of wireless electronic devices, including smartphones, shrank nearly 30% on year, marking the largest fall since July 2012. Car exports also dropped 24% to 2.4 billion US dollars. With such disappointing figures, some experts point to problems with Korea's high reliance on big business groups and say that it's time to break away from the model of trickle-down growth to find a better way for the Korean economy to move forward.
And for more on this, Professor Yang Jun-seok from the Catholic University of Korea joins us in the studio today. Great to have you here.
Happy to be here.
So I think it's fair for us to say that Korea rose from the ashes of the Korean War to see such rapid economic success on the back of growth of its conglomerates. So to explain this all, can you tell us more about this trickle-down effect?
Okay, well, during the 1970s, especially when Korea was trying to develop its heavy industries, Korea gave preference, sort of a permission for certain companies to engage in certain areas, shipbuilding, automobiles, semiconductors, and so on. Now, I think there's two ways that you can call this a trickle-down effect. The first is the usual trickle-down effect. When these conglomerates do very well, the national income goes up and spending goes up, and that creates income and jobs for the rest of the population. Now, sometimes in the past, you've seen the parent or the upstream company protect the downstream companies when downstream companies get into trouble, but we haven't seen much of that lately. Lately, the upstream companies, in order to maintain their profitability, sometimes squeezes the downstream companies, and that's creating a lot of trouble here. So I'm not sure if you could call that strictly trickle-down system anymore.
Now, I think another problem is that Korean conglomerates are actually struggling to stay on the top of the global market, especially with the recent debacle with Samsung's Note 7 recalls, as well as Hyundai Motor's labor union strikes. So what's the situation like right now?
Okay, well, September, the export performance was, at least in the whole number, very disappointing. Exports fell by 5.9%, and according to the Ministry of Industry, of that 5.9%, about half, 2.6%, is due to the Hyundai Motor strike, and perhaps another 0.9% was due to reduction of sales of smartphones, mostly because of the Samsung problem. But on the other hand, this is bad news, obviously, but it's not a disastrous news.
Okay.
Nomura Securities expects Samsung to have a revenue loss of about $9 billion US dollars, but even if that entire loss comes from exports, goes to exports. Korean exports in 2015 was 527 billion US dollars.
Okay.
So that's about 2%. It's not a negligible amount, but it's not a disastrous amount.
I also think the bigger problem here is that the Korean economy is highly dependent on conglomerates when it comes to growth. So how does Korea's dependence on these major business groups compare to other countries?
Okay, but there's not a perfect measure for this, but the usual measure that people look at is sales as compared to the size of the GDP. And Korea, if you look at the OECD economies with more than $1 trillion worth of GDP, Korea ranks the largest. Samsung sales is about 13.8% of Korea's GDP. Hyundai Motors takes another about 8%. So just those two companies account, the size of their sales is about 20% of the GDP. They also take a substantial portion of exports as well. So we are very much dependent on some of these larger conglomerates. But on the other hand, the reason that they do take so much share of the conglomerates is because they are very productive and they have very high level of efficiency that we don't see in a lot of other smaller companies. So it just points out the problem that Korea needs to improve its productivity.
And I know you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but there's a lot of talk about this trickle-down effect and how it no longer brings benefits to the Korean economy anymore. So what are your thoughts on this?
Okay, well, if you want to run a heavy industry type of economy, you have to have large conglomerates because they require a lot of capital investment. So there's no way around that. So as long as we stick with the heavy industry manufacturing type of an economy, we'll probably be stuck with very high dependence on conglomerates anyway. So we do need to develop some other alternate, more nimble type of firms if we are going to, say, get away from dependence on larger conglomerates.
And also these kinds of problems were highlighted in examples from in Germany with Volkswagen when it cheated on emissions scandal and it affected the German economy as a whole. So are there any other cases like that around the world?
Well, the most notorious example is Nokia. Okay. Finland economy accounted for about, their sales were about 25% of Finnish GDP, even though their economy is smaller than Korea's. And when Nokia got into problems because their smartphones could not compete with Apple's smartphones, that brought the entire economy to a slowdown, which they haven't really recovered from even today.
Now, so experts have been saying that it's time for Korea to find other ways so that small and medium-sized companies could grow in line with conglomerates, as well as perhaps seek a paradigm shift in its growth strategy. So do you think the right measures are being taken right now, and what could be improved?
Well, if you look at the sort of the SME, small and medium-sized enterprise development plans, I think they basically have two tracks. The first track is trying to have an R&D-based, very nimble technology companies. The problem with that particular track, though, is that there seems to be a lack of creative people, creative entrepreneurs. Even if you get good ideas and you manage to get capital, which is very difficult at this stage, even if you do that, a lot of these companies feel that larger conglomerates or even the government is stealing their ideas. There's a lack of IPR protection and there's lack of good enforcement on competition policy. So even if they create these companies, they're shut out by the larger conglomerates. Then there's the second track. A lot of times, they just seem to be interested in keeping the SMEs alive, not necessarily
making
productive,
them better.
Not necessarily efficient. And the latest research shows that you really need your SMEs to be efficient and productive, high productivity in order for them to do well and to export. But we just seem to be interested in keeping those companies alive, so what we end up creating is a lot of zombie SMEs. And that's not good for Korea in the long run either.
Right. Thank you so much for coming in today, Professor.
Thank you.
And that does it for today, but we'll be back tomorrow with more business news that matters to you. So don't forget to tune in then. Thanks for watching, and bye-bye.